Hello and welcome to another episode of Professional Book Girl. My name is Kayla and I read a ton of books so that I can recommend the best to you. And today is a very exciting episode. It is an author interview with one of my favorite authors, Stephanie Dray. She writes amazing historical / biographical fiction. If you listened to Monday's episode, you heard me gush about her latest release, Madam Secretary, about Frances Perkins, who is the first female cabinet member of any president. She worked with FDR. She has touched all of our lives, whether you know it or not. She is one of the most consequential figures in American history. I loved the book so much, and I had just finished my interview with Stephanie, and I feel like I love it even more now in hindsight, getting to learn what went into the book, what went into the writing. We had a really great chat, not even just about Frances, but about historical fiction and the state of the genre. So if you are a historical fiction fan, you need to listen to this interview. I enjoyed my chat with Stephanie so much, so please enjoy my interview with Stephanie Dray. Stephanie, I am so excited to have you here today. You are one of my favorite historical fiction authors. I have your books on my favorite shelf, which is a very high honor for any author. And I was obsessed with your latest release, Madam Secretary. Can you kind of give the elevator pitch for the book?
Well, it's a hard book to boil down, but it's essentially an enemies to lovers romance without the actual romance between Frances Perkins and FDR on her journey to become the most important woman in American history.
I am obsessed with that characterization, the enemies to lovers. We will definitely talk about FDR in a bit, but when I was picking this up, I was like, oh, FDR is my favorite president. So I was like, okay, we're getting like an FDR book, but he's in it, but I think you did a really great job of he didn't overshadow Frances in any way. This is very much fully her story. I was shocked, like in a negative way, that I had never heard of her before. And I was very upset and angry after finishing this. I feel like the New York public school system did not serve me well with that. How did you kind of discover Frances, and how did you choose her to be the subject of your book?
Well, I should start by saying that I also grew up in New York. So I think the New York educational system, fine as it is, also failed me because I had not heard of Frances Perkins when I was young either. And this in spite of the fact that FDR was a huge hero in my family. My family are relatively recent immigrants to the American scene. They came in the early 20th century. They were, in fact, the sort of immigrants that Frances helped in her career. And my grandparents lived through the Great Depression, and they told me a lot of stories about having to forage for food. And I even lost a great uncle when he was a teenager. He tried to steal coal from a passing train to keep the family warm during a very cold New York winter, and he died. And so my grandparents always talked about FDR with reverence because the New Deal is what they believe helped them survive and get out of that terribly crushing period of American history. And yet they never mentioned Frances Perkins. Of course, I knew that she was our first female federal cabinet secretary, and I knew she was sort of a great lady, but I didn't know much more about that, especially because most of the pictures that we see of her are very dowdy. She's a very matronly lady, and for some reason, like with the hubris of youth, right? You never remember that these people were once young too. And so it wasn't until I was doing a little research with my friend and sometimes co-author Laura Moy on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that I saw pictures of young Frances Perkins. And she witnessed that fire, and she was such a firebrand at that age. And I just was astonished, and I sort of castigated myself, like, how did I not know this? And once I realized who she was and how her legacy impacts our everyday life, I had to write.
I have so many questions popping in my head just from what you just said. Specifically, the one main point that Frances makes throughout this book is that she really chose her clothing in a very specific way. Like, I am a historical fiction girly, and I'm also a fashion girly. I went to FIT for college, where actually we would have like yearly memorial services for the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So
Oh,
that
wow.
is like very seared into my brain. I remember the first time I learned about it. She found that she had to approach these men as if she was their mother, which I
Yeah,
thought was so interesting. And she chose to dress kind of boringly.
she did. She eventually sort of discovered in her public work, she started out as a social worker, and then she entered the sort of political arena. And when she did so, of course, she was I don't want to say a victim of discrimination, but she was subject to a lot of discrimination. I mean, this was a time that women couldn't even vote. And so it occurred to her that if she dressed very matronly, that they would not, pinch her butt and flirt with her, and they might take her more seriously. So from the time that she was in her early 30s, she decided to sort of, when she was, at work, she was dressed like a schoolmarm. Now, I'm going to do a little asterisk here because this is fun. So you might notice that on the cover of Becoming Madam Secretary, she is in fact wearing a very stylish blue jacket and hat. And and when I saw this cover image, I fell in love immediately. I thought it was so vibrant and so great. But I thought, oh no, she's like iconic for being like wearing very unfashionable clothes. We can't have a fine tailored jacket on the cover. And thankfully, the Frances Perkins Association, I was talking to them, and Sarah Peskin, who directs the organization, she said, well, you might not know this, but Frances had a lot of fashionable and blue clothing in her closet. And they have pictures of it, and they sent it to me. So she apparently saved some of her fashionable pieces for when she wasn't on duty.
Well, there's this scene in the book where she is going to an event and her friend Mary kind of makes her wear this fashionable blue jacket with the fur trim. So when I read that, I was like, oh, I wonder if this is what
That is,
she's wearing on the
I pushed
cover.
that right in. Yes.
I'm glad I picked up on that. Also, you mentioned the story of your family and your uncle, which I love history and I love hearing like firsthand accounts like that. And I think you did a really great job in this book of, we look back on the Great Depression. I feel like specifically in this time of turmoil we're living on, everyone's like 100 years ago, what was it like? You did such a great job of bringing these immigrants to life, bringing these factory workers to life. Like I live in an old tenement actually, and I think about that a lot. But the story of your uncle, that was included in the book, right?
Yes, I had the privilege of reading a lot of Frances's actual letters and letters that she received and letters that she sent. And I included a lot of those in the book. And then I decided, as a tribute to my grandfather, who grieved the loss of his brother all his life, that I would make up a little letter from him to Frances. And I did this for two reasons, in part because it was such an important part of his formative experiences, and secondly, because she kicked off the Civilian Conservation Corps, which my grandfather joined.
Oh,
So he
wow.
was able to send back a dollar, to keep the family alive. And so, even though he shamefully did not tell me about Frances Perkins, I like to think that he admired her greatly. So I did have a little bit of fun there, flipping that.
I really love that. So, as we were talking, you're kind of mentioning your research process. I'm always very interested when it comes to these historical fiction novels. What is the research like? I actually was just in a bookstore with a friend last week, and we were talking about how it seems like authors are kind of churning out a book a year. But then when it comes to historical fiction, I know there's a wider gap. A book a year, as a reader, I love it. But I feel like for the author, it's a lot. There is a wider gap with historical fiction because I know, as someone so obsessed with genre, so much goes into just one book. And especially with all of your books, specifically with this one, that so comes across. I felt like I was reading not a textbook because it was so entertaining, but I was like, I got an education reading this book, which is why I love historical fiction. So, what was your process like, and how long did it take you?
So I started this book at the height of the pandemic, March 2020.
Wow.
And I realized that I was not going to be able to go to the places that I might normally go. Wouldn't be able to visit her, her family homestead in Maine. I wasn't going to be able to go to New York City. Fortunately, Columbia University had digitized about 5,000 pages of Frances's oral history. So that's what I relied on at the start. And eventually I was able to get photographs of the paper there and expand. This is not my normal process. And because there was a pandemic in the middle of this and I moved,
Oh, wow.
it took a little longer than normal. It's been 4 books, 4 years, 4 books. I wish it was 4 books. 4 years since the Women of Chateau Lafayette. That's not the gap that I normally like to have between books, but I do. I'm so. I think this is the kind of interview where we can talk about the state of the genre a little bit.
Well,
And
I have questions about it.
great, because I think, there is the trend and the pressure to put out a book a year. However, the research process is long and laborious. You have to learn, like, I didn't know anything about the Great Depression, so other than what my grandparents had told me. So I had to immerse myself in a whole new time period. And that takes a lot of time. So I think what's happened, and you'll notice this in the trends of stories, is that we're getting a little bit away from biographical fiction. We're starting to veer more into more slices of someone's life, because then you really sort of can, well, theoretically, you only have to research that part that is relevant. Personally, that's the worst of all worlds for me, because I would definitely go down all the rabbit holes, learn everything about this person, even if I was only telling like a 2-year story. But I think a lot of authors are now designing their stories to be more efficient and shorter, and that impacts literature. Uh, it impacts the kind of stories that we're reading and the education that we're receiving. Um, Personally, this is the shortest book that I've written in a long time, and yet I'm getting readers who are like, this is kind of long. Well, the trend has been towards sort of a 75,000 word book. That's not a lot of space to get to know a monumental historic figure. So this one, I will say to readers, this is shorter. It'll be fine for your book clubs, but it is meaty. So appreciate all that went into it.
So I wanted to ask you about historical fiction versus biographical fiction, but leading into that, I love both, but I fell in love with historical fiction because I realized you can learn history from women's perspectives. So that is why, like, a book like this, I was like obsessed. And you did such a great job with the plotting and the pacing. It's not until like I think a little bit more than halfway through the book that FDR is actually president, and now we're actually getting in with her being in the cabinet. But it would be a shame if you left out all of what she did before that, because there is so much, not even just her political work, but her personal life, her husband and his mental illness. That was like, truth is stranger than fiction in that
Right,
case. Like,
right.
I couldn't believe that. And you did such a great job of kind of weaving that all through. You have The Women of Chateau Lafayette behind you. I have that book behind me as well. I
Oh,
remember reading that in 2020. I loved it. And that book, you did cover more, like, it was 3 characters though. What is it like for you to kind of then, that book is longer but it's split up among different women, this one is just specifically one person?
I think it did give me more of a chance to sit with Frances and sort of try to get into her head and her voice. And now she would not have wanted me to. She was a very private person, so I was kind of aware the whole time I was writing the book, like, probably wouldn't be thrilled with it. But I also thought that part of the reason that she is not better remembered, despite her monumental achievement, is that she did keep her personal life so private. And Americans, we love stories. We love the personal gossip. We want to hear all the tea. And so, we remember FDR not just because of his political accomplishments, but because of his colorful life. So Frances, by obscuring her personal life, kind of did a detriment to her own legacy. And I hope that by bringing her story alive, that people will remember her better. Now, of course, with the Women of Chateau Lafayette, I had one character who was fictionalized in that story. The other 2 were real women, but I had a very sort of narrow focus in that I was talking about the Lafayette legacy. In this case, I'm really trying to grasp at what made Frances become our first female secretary, cabinet secretary, and what kept her in the job, because she was our longest serving Secretary of Labor in history, and she wanted to resign most of that time.
When this book comes out, I think most readers will be like, this is historical fiction. And I think it's people who are like me and just so into the genre that I would be like, no, this is biographical. What do you think about that distinction? Like, if someone says Madam Secretary is historical fiction, are you okay with that? Or is it important to you to have biographical with it?
Fine with either way, because I was just talking about a book the other day called Rodham, which is
Mm-hmm.
actually about Hillary Rodham Clinton, and it is biographical in terms of how it's filling out her sort of background and her life story, but it's also speculative fiction in that it theorizes, well, what if Hillary never married Bill? And I still think that's historical fiction, and it really made me think, okay, well, there are a lot of blurred lines in here, so I'm willing to accept either categorization for my novels. I don't have any speculative elements in Becoming Madam Secretary, but I used to write historical fantasy, so it's
Oh,
all historical fiction for me.
I have read Rodham, and I was almost like, this is like, it's not magical realism, but I was like, this is like the multiverse kind of. So, how do you choose your subjects? I imagine it's a very important decision. How do you kind of when you're sitting down to write your next book, are there ever like a few different people you're choosing between? What's that process like for you?
Nexus between the stories that I want to tell and the stories that I think publishers and readers will buy. And that's a sort of smaller subset of the people that I'm interested in. For example, with the Women of Chateau Lafayette, I tell the story behind it all the time, where I wanted to write about Adrienne. And at the time, these stories were not popular. And my agent at the time was like, you cannot write about her. She wasn't a queen. She she wasn't American, and she didn't even get her head cut off during the French Revolution.
Oh my God.
So I had to find a way of making that story more relevant, and they wanted a World War II element. And I didn't think that there would be a crossover between Lafayette and the Nazis, but it turns out there is. So I was able to fashion that story. Now, with Becoming Madam Secretary, I knew I wanted to write about a powerful American figure, if I could. And here was a founding mother of the 20th century. So this sort of fit my brand in that I write about founding mothers like Patsy Jefferson and Eliza Hamilton, but also it sort of fits more of what the market is looking for in terms of more modern heroines. The 20th century was anyway more popular when I was choosing what subject to write about, and it's hard because there are many more books that I want to write than I can actually write. So we have to find the one that works at any given time.
So you just mentioned kind of what is popular, and I keep up with historical fiction, and I find it exciting when I notice trends in what's
Yeah.
happening. And this book, I think, breaks the trends, though. It is so different from anything I've read, which to me is so exciting. So you mentioned like a World War II element. What is that? I think a lot of readers, though, are look, I'll always pick up a World War II book because there's so much to learn there. What is that pressure like for you to kind of have to choose based off of that? And then who have you had to kind of scrap because it wasn't really following the trend?
I don't know if I'm going to answer that because I might still write those people.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to give anybody a premature heads up, but but I will talk a little bit about the pressures of that. I have lots of author friends, and we'll sit around and we'll complain. We'll say like, well, I have this great story about Caterina Sforza, and I can't publish it because nobody wants that time period. I think that's sort of Renaissance time period. I don't know for sure what time period that is, which indicates that was not my book idea. I will not say whose it was. Um, and so we always are trying to think of like, well, how can we shoehorn in what we want to do, and still make it marketable. Because I'm a commercial women's historical fiction writer. There are literary fiction writers, and they are, marvelously artistic, and they win awards. And I do not write that kind of book. I write a book that I want to be, very popular and as accessible as possible, because it's more my mission to make women understand that we have always been part of world history, that now that we have the vote, we have more power and also more responsibility to participate in the process and shape the world that we are living in and that our children are living in.
Well, I think you do a really great job. Sometimes with historical fiction, it feels like homework. And those are typically, I try to stray away from those because when you're reading a book, you want it to be entertaining. And I think you do a really great job. Like, I feel like I downloaded so much history and information in this book, but it was in such an entertaining way. Everything is like perfectly paced and plotted. Is that something you are thinking about as you're writing it?
Yeah, like I want my books to be fun. I mean, we definitely. I personally, I love to learn from historical fiction, and I love when people say that they have learned from my books, or it has inspired them to go look something up, or maybe even change their focus of study at school. That's awesome. I live for that. But I'm a novelist, so I want it to be fun and entertaining, and so I really will focus on the parts of a life story that tickle me, or grab me emotionally. And in this book, the relationship between Francis and FDR was the thing that really surprised me, because it didn't occur to me that they would have started off as rivals and disliked each other. And they were very funny people, and so their relationship as it evolved was very amusing to me. And I wanted to make sure that the reader came away with that sort of fun, because there's also a lot of heavy topics in the book, right? There's the Great Depression, there is a forthcoming war, the rise of Hitler, um, serious mental illnesses. So I'm always reaching for the lighthearted moments when I can find them, and to keep the pages turning, because real people's lives don't always fit into a nice narrative arc. And real people have times in their lives that are boring, and no one wants to read about that. So I have spared you. You're welcome.
Let's just talk about FDR now. So I felt like I kind of got to see a different side of him in this book. So I mentioned earlier, FDR is my favorite president, but more importantly to me, Eleanor is my favorite first lady. So I feel like I'm always in at least like historical fiction, or I watch the show First Ladies, kind of viewing him through Eleanor's lens. I actually feel like I saw a different side of Eleanor in this book too,
Yeah.
because they were colleagues, really. What was it like writing about the two of them? You did it in such a way that this was in no way an FDR and Eleanor book. They were just characters in this story, but I felt like you did capture their essence and who they were in such a way that it fit in with everything I already knew about them. I was just like, oh, this is a different side.
Well, another, you by bringing this up, you remind me that one of the things I struggled with in this novel is that, I too adore Eleanor. She's like the saintly first lady. Like, she can do no wrong in my book. And then Francis, who also very much admires Eleanor, and they were friends. But they have a strained relationship, and I couldn't figure out why until I started really delving into Francis's oral history, and I realized these are two very different ladies. Eleanor makes connections with people by being very open and sharing everything. And Frances is a buttoned up New Englander who is mortified by what she thinks of as Eleanor's oversharing, or, telling her things where she feels like she would rather gnaw her arm off than remain in this conversation, because she can't talk bad about her boss, who is Eleanor's husband. So um, I just really had a lot of fun being able to see Eleanor through eyes that still admired her, but also showed that she she could be seen through a different lens, as we might want to say. And the same with FDR, that could be a rat bastard, and he was a ruthless political animal, but he was broadly compassionate. And to me, he is one of the greatest presidents in history. I would put him up with Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. It's pretty much how I would rank them. So I think Francis was very clear-eyed about both of these figures, and that made me see them clear-eyed too. But it did not diminish my admiration for them at all.
That's kind of how I felt coming away from the book as well. And I find even with FDR, I read The First Ladies by Marie
Oh yeah,
Benedict, and
yeah.
I'm blanking on the other author's name. And I was like, oh, like he's such an asshole sometimes. But I think it's important to kind of see all the different, these are people. And in the historical, people tend to be sainted as we look back on them. So I think it's important to see all of the different sides. So you mentioned before your fellow authors of historical fiction that you're friends with. I just, as an observer on Instagram, it seems like there's a really great community among you guys, and it's very exciting as a fan of all of you to witness. I'm curious, like, what is it like having that, almost like a support group, I would assume, and does your writing ever impact each other?
Uh, yes, it does. And I'm going to talk very specifically about my closest historical fiction friends, even though I don't want to give short shrift to the sort of broader community of historical authors, or I have a huge network of historical fiction authors that I adore and who we all help each other out, and they're brilliant. And I I feel like it's a very warm and supportive community because we're all doing something that's a little bit weird. There's writing in general, and then historical fiction writing is its own animal, and we're all very nerdy in the same way. Um, but my very close personal friends are co-authors that we have worked together on projects. So that would be Kate Quinn and Laura Camoy, and some others too, Eliza Knight, uh, Heather Webb. Uh, but with Kate and Laura and I, we're pretty close, and we're critique partners. So my fingerprints are, on Kate's books, and Kate's fingerprints are all over my books. Some of the most clever things that happen are, Kate had suggested them, and I hope that I have contributed similarly in her work. And it's really great because you get the eye of somebody who loves you, but who also is not afraid to say, this whole storyline is not going to work. You need to tear it out and start again.
That's so It makes so much sense, I guess, because I'm huge fans of all the authors that you mentioned. So I'm sure it happens among other genres, but I think like looking through specifically like Instagram, it just seems so clear that there really is this camaraderie. And it's exciting as a reader to see. And like I know you guys are always promoting each other's books, and sometimes we're like, oh wait, like Eliza and I just wrote down like, oh, her next book, I need to read that from seeing it on someone else's
Stephanie
post.
Thornton. I was wrong to not mention Stephanie Thornton, who has actually been a critique partner of mine going all the way back to my earliest book.
I'm also a huge fan of hers as well. The first half of the book, I would say, is about kind of the beginning of her political career leading up to FDR's presidency and her time in the cabinet. I thought that the depiction of New York and specifically Hell's Kitchen was so strong. And I was remembering things I learned about in school, like the FDA, and when she goes into a bakery, and I was like gagging. And then we mentioned earlier the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. I remember the first time that I learned about that, and then I went to a school where it was kind of reiterated, that tragic event. The way that you wrote about the fire specifically, it was so hard to read, but I think it is important for all of us to remember and to look back and see how far we've come. And throughout the book that fire played a significant role in Frances's life and career. What was it like bringing to life this kind of like seedy side of New York and American history?
Bringing alive the seedy side of New York was fun because that's not my personal experience, and I got to do a lot of fun research about this. And anytime I'm learning something while I'm writing, I'm having a blast. The slight exceptions for that are the really dark things, and that is not just a seedy neighborhood, but one that is perhaps on fire.
Right.
And so when we're talking about women who are jumping out of buildings, uh, and New York has the horrible destiny to have had that happen more than once. Um, yep, that was actually a very rough writing week. I remember looking at pictures of dead bodies all that week while I was writing. I was looking at the photos that came out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and I even did something that I really kind of regret now. I wanted to understand what the sound a human body hitting the pavement might be like. So I went in search of a sound file. And I do not like that sound. It was, I wanted to bring it alive for readers, but that did not come without a little bit of cost to me to write that. So I hope that it does. I hope that it was worth it. But I don't want writers or readers to think that that is easy or fun because that part is.
I think that comes across as you're reading it, and it felt more visceral and real than when you learn about it in a school setting and like in a textbook. But we know that event ignited the fire Frances already had, but I
Yeah.
felt like it ignited, well, I mean, that is a horrible metaphor of fire, but
Too. I think I said like lit the spark, and then
yeah.
oh
I was
no.
like, oh, wait, hold on. But I found myself getting like reading it, I was already so angry, but then I knew about this event, but like reading it again, I was like, let's go. I'm ready for Frances to fight. And she was so modern. And as we get through like the presidency and her time in the cabinet, she is the person who fought for social services, like unemployment. I'm actually starting a new job tomorrow. I've been unemployed, and I've been on unemployment, and as I was reading this, I was like, oh my god, like her work has been directly impacting my life these last few months. I would not have survived without what she did for us 100 years ago. So it was very kind of a weird timing in my life to read about that. What was the most surprising thing that you learned that she fought for, that all of her work impacts all of us to this day, but what's kind of the most significant one?
Well, the most significant achievement of Frances Perkins would be the Social Security system, and that even though child labor, if I had to pinpoint one thing that Frances felt the strongest about, it was probably the abolition of child labor. But her ideas and her pioneering spirit for Social Security really transformed the whole nation. Um, it was a larger solution to many smaller problems that she had been working on all along. I mean, most of us think of Social Security as only retirement for the elderly, but of course, it's a much broader program uh, dealing with widows' benefits and handicap, I'm sorry, disabilities and such. So um, it transformed all of American life for the past 80 years. And I can't think of any other woman in American history that has had such a lasting impact. And I say that, I remember at the beginning of our talk, I said she was the most important woman in American history. And I know people will fight me on this, and they'll want to say Eleanor, or they'll name someone else. But even Eleanor, as incredible as she was, does not leave such a lasting legacy that impacts us every day. People who are listening to us talk right now can look up overhead, and if they see a sprinkler system in their house or in their place of work, that's thanks to Frances Perkins. If they had a weekend and they didn't have to work in a factory, that's Frances Perkins. If they got to go to school as a child instead of making candy in a factory and risking life and limb. That is her influence. If they went to a restaurant, say, on that weekend that they enjoyed, and they didn't have rat droppings in their food, that is Frances Perkins. And so, everywhere you look, her influence is there. And I cannot think of any other American woman who has had that kind of impact. And honestly, very few American men have had that sort of impact. I think it's Lawrence O'Donnell who said that she was the most consequential cabinet secretary since Alexander Hamilton. And I'd have to agree.
I fully agree with you also. I feel like whenever I come out of these historical fiction books after like learning about a real woman, I always say I'm so glad that I now know her story. But with Frances, I just felt this like I felt so inspired and I felt it so much like so strongly. And I was like, this woman, what she did 100 years ago literally has repercussions for my life right now. And I can't think of any other time I have closed a book and felt that way. So I'm so grateful to you for finally pulling her out of the shadows of history. And I'm so excited for people to read this book and also learn more about her. You meant that Alexander Hamilton bit is in kind of the historical note at the end. And you also, first of all, for anyone listening, you always have to read the author's note and historical note because there's such a wealth of information in there. And you mentioned having to leave things out. What was kind of the most interesting thing that you had to leave out just for timing, I'm assuming?
Well, I had originally written much farther into Frances's career as Madam Secretary, including a failed assassination attempt, although there were those too.
Wow.
There was a failed impeachment attempt against Frances, and I had actually started this book in part because I wanted to write about that. And the evolution of the book, it goes in its own direction, and then next thing you know, I'm like, but I can't leave out the part where she's back in New York. So the book shifted a lot, and I ended up leaving off a lot of those later years, especially when she visited France um, in the run up to the war, when everyone was saying, "Don't worry about Hitler. There's the Maginot Line, and the French are totally solid, and it'll be fine." And Frances was the first to tell FDR, uh, "You're being fed a line here. I've been to France, and I think they would fall over if someone gave them one hard punch." So
Wow.
I was sorry to have to leave that kind of thing out because she is viewed largely as a domestic figure, and she was, but she also had a role to play in the Second World War, and I would have loved to get into that, and I wasn't able to. And
So I do think though we did get to see a bit of her impact with World War II because we see her fighting for Jewish refugees and for them to be admitted into the country. And I found this to be, I love when this happens and I'll say in my head, I'll be like, oh, it's like a multiverse. And then I'm like, no, it's actually the real universe and real history because I love connecting historical threads. In a lot of World War II historical fiction, you specifically taking place in Europe, you'll read about the states not taking in
yeah,
refugees, but she was looking for loopholes and fighting to get these people in. What was that like? You did include some of the World War II bits, so I guess what was the thought process behind just including the one, which I'm so glad that you did.
I did that because she was fighting for that in 1933, right? And the United States doesn't enter the war until 1941. So it was important for me to show that Frances was well aware of what was happening, and so was FDR. He gets actually a lot of criticism for being late to the war, but I think that was more a function of the political atmosphere that he was working in. Um, there were a lot of challenges and a lot of isolationism in the United States, and there was, quite honestly, people don't like to remember this, but there were American Nazis, and Frances was their enemy, and they actually denounced her. And I always thought, if that happened, she should have put that on her tombstone. I mean, that's something to be proud of. the American Nazi Party denounces you by name at a giant rally. So that was an important part of her character and her moral strength. So I did want to include that if I could.
It is included in the book when the American Nazis denounce her, and FDR says something along the lines of like, you should be so proud of that. And I laughed reading that. I thought that was like a really funny little anecdote. So you mentioned that there's an oral history of Frances, but how do you kind of slip into a real person's tone and voice? And do you find it specifically through like the firsthand accounts?
Yes, the fact that we were able to have that this is the first character I've ever written where I was actually able to listen to her real voice. There was recording of her talking. And so that was always in the back of my mind. And then there's her oral history that I read. And then, the biographies were helpful, but they don't catch the tone or tenor of the person. So I tried my best to adopt her tone and tenor and also to incorporate her words when I could. But ultimately, I am not as wise or witty or profound as Frances Perkins. So the parts of the book that maybe don't seem quite as inspiring, those were probably me rather than her.
Well, I think I find it interesting when I just read an Alison Ware book and she said that like most of the dialogue is about Catherine of Aragon. She was pulled from like actual words Catherine had written them. And I find that so interesting. It was like, where does the author interject their own voice in it then? Because it's still your book. It still
Yeah.
needs to sound like you wrote it.
I try to be as much of a chameleon as I can, but ultimately, of course, my voice will come through. And in that case, I try to channel the parts of me that I might have in common with Frances, uh, and that's very little, but one of the things that I think we have in common is that I can kind of be a that's the facts kind of person, and I just want to get to the heart of the matter, and so I would try to identify with that. And even though I wasn't a New Englander, I was a New Yorker, and so I was able to pull in some of that too.
I loved how she would always say, like, I'm a New Englander, like, the cold didn't bother her, or like she just used the phrase New Englander so often. I really enjoyed that little tidbit.
And that was that was all her, but she was feisty, and I loved bringing that to light. And I remember when in the Women of Chateau Lafayette, I had three different women, and I had to make them sound all very different, and they were. Fortunately, Beatrice Chandler had a very funny tone, and those most of the funny things in that book were just things that she had actually said.
This is so random and completely off topic, but I have to just tell you because you mentioned it.
I know.
In the Chateau Lafayette, I forgot which character is, but her husband has a prosthetic leg and he like
Yeah.
takes it off and throws it in a restaurant.
Yes.
I'm a huge Bravo fan, and on Real Housewives of New York, a woman did that. And I remembered reading your book and I was like, oh my God, like Aviva's leg throw wasn't even original. Somebody did it before her.
It wasn't. And when I found out that that had actually happened, I was like, oh, that's totally going in the book.
Yes. When I read, I picture things as a movie, so I can like literally picture like that scene in my head to this day so vividly. I love it. So I just have a few kind of like quick fire questions to wrap this up. What was your favorite thing that you learned about Frances? I know we've talked a lot about things we loved, but is there one thing that really stands out?
I liked that she was a dog lover. She had her little dog Balto, who managed to escape the first day that she was sworn in as Madam Secretary and caused her no end of trouble. But you know, as Frances liked to present herself as a buttoned-up person, but then you see these photos of her romping around with her dog, and you know that there's a silly person in there somewhere.
I love that. What are you currently reading?
I just finished Remarkably Bright Creatures, which is not historical fiction. Usually I'm reading historical fiction, but every now and then I slip in something else. And that one, it was very amusing and it stars an octopus.
Oh, okay. Yes. I haven't read that one yet, but I will add it to the ever growing list. So, on my show, I like to open up every episode talking about something I'm currently obsessed with. It could either be like a TV show, music. I'm currently obsessed with Love on the Spectrum. I actually just finished it this morning and I'm like
I
obsessed.
watched that too. My husband and I watched that. Yeah.
Oh, so sweet. Is there something you're currently obsessed with, outside of the bookish world?
Yes. So I am obsessed with foster kittens because I foster kittens from the local shelter. And so at the moment I have in my office, this is not my office, this is my husband's office. And the reason I did that is because my office has been taken over by a little feral foster kitten named Mr. McGriddles,
Oh,
who came to us full of piss and vinegar, as they say. Can I say that on a podcast? I don't know.
yeah, we can say anything here.
And now, he's very slowly been won over. And this morning he wanted to play this little mousy game with me, and he's like, "Come on, turn it on." Mouse for Cats on I guess it's just an app that you can use on your iPad. So I'm just obsessed with kittens and kitten care and getting them good homes. And if people follow my Facebook page, they'll see a million pictures of kittens.
So sweet. I love that. This is my last question for you. Can you tell us what's next? If any hints that you can
I
give us?
can indeed. So what's next is Laura Camoy and I are getting the band back together again. And we are working on a new novel about Abigail Adams and her daughter Nabby. It's going to be called A Founding Mother, and we're very excited for it. And we think it'll be out in 2026. So
Okay, I think
sounds like a long time, but it's not.
listeners will know you were kind of answering this public plea I put out. I was like, for my book club pick, we just read The Frozen River, and that's kind of like,
that too.
oh,
Loved
so
it.
great. It's kind of like revolutionary era, and I'm like, I need more like founding families, revolutionary era historical fiction. So you are making my wish come true with that one.
Yay, yay.
Thank you so, so much for joining me today. I think it is very clear I adored your book, and I love it even more now getting to hear kind of what went into it and just chatting with you. So thank you for all that you do with the genre and your books, and kind of really giving all of us readers an education and these women that we need to know about. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you today.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. You're such a warm and inviting hostess.
Thank you.